Let me begin by clarifying the title of my presentation. I do not intend to speak about the legation during the period that it served as a diplomatic presence. This presentation will focus on the post-1976 period, during which the building in which we are now gathered, albeit most of us virtually, functioned as a museum and cultural center. So in fact, this presentation is on the role of the Tangier American Legation Museum, not the legation itself, and its governing body, the Tangier American Legation Institute for Moroccan Studies, Talim, formerly known as the Tangier American Legation Museum Society, TALMS, and its role in the preservation of Morocco's cultural heritage. It is also important that I clarify what I mean by cultural heritage. In the context of this paper, the United Nations generally divides cultural heritage into two categories. Cultural heritage, simply put and full stop, versus intangible cultural heritage. The former is epitomized by those places designated cultural World Heritage Sites by UNESCO. World Heritage Sites were established by a convention agreed upon during the General Conference of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, in 1972. As a UNESCO document, the convention is heavily reliant on the notion of, quote, universal value, but its classification schema is applicable to any group of people with a common heritage and therefore relevant to my discussion. Cultural heritage sites are specifically enumerated as monuments, groups of buildings, or sites defined as, quote, works of man or the combined works of nature and man that have value from the point of view of history, art, or science. And that's the language, hence the use of the word man from the actual convention in 1972. What these three types have in common with the natural heritage sites that are also protected by the same convention is that they are all places. They're not immutable, as they can be remodeled, renovated, damaged, destroyed, but they do have physicality. They exist as locations on a map, and this is a map of the UNESCO cultural and natural heritage sites. On a semantic level, monuments, groups of buildings, and sites do not fully represent the totality of what we think of as cultural heritage, for example. So, at the UNESCO General Conference in 2003, participants agreed to a second Cultural Heritage Convention, this time on safeguarding intangible cultural heritage, which it defined as the practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, skills, as well as the instruments, objects, artifacts, and cultural spaces associated therewith that communities, groups, and in some cases, individuals recognize as part of their cultural heritage. This is intangible cultural heritage transmitted from generation to generation is constantly recreated by communities and groups in response to their environment, their interaction with nature and their history, and provides them with a sense of identity and continuity, thus promoting respect for cultural diversity and human creativity. It's manifested inter alia in the following domains: oral traditions and expressions, including language as a vehicle of intangible cultural heritage, performing arts, social practices, rituals, and festive events, knowledge and practices concerning nature and the universe, and traditional craftsmanship. And you can see sort of an idea or concept map of the notions of intangible cultural heritage to the left. This is from the UNESCO website. UNESCO's original definition of intangible cultural heritage is a bit difficult to pin down, not only because it specifically refers to instruments, objects, and artifacts, all of which most certainly can be and more often are tangible, but also because it emphasizes orality and changeability. In between these two is a whole set of elements that are either written or recorded in some way. There is no specific UNESCO convention to protect these manifestations of cultural heritage, at least not that I'm aware of. But one is not really necessary given that this type of cultural heritage is already protected by intellectual property laws, by which I mean copyright, patent laws, and the like. It would certainly make things a lot easier for those of us involved in cultural heritage on a global scale, cultural heritage protection on a global scale, if there were a UNESCO convention that standardized intellectual property laws around the world. But that is a consideration for another considerably more extended paper. This type of cultural heritage is generally preserved in libraries, archives, museums, and similar cultural institutions. It is extraordinarily diverse. If you think back to the map, where the concept map we saw before, and generally not created with the cultural heritage preservation in mind. Very rarely are intangible cultural heritage objects created for purposes of preservation, which of course is very oppositional to the notion of cultural heritage that's monument based. It may include correspondence, ledgers, photographs, maps, reports, sketches, audio and video recordings, and much more. Indeed, the challenge for those concerned with cultural heritage preservation is often choosing what is to be preserved from this plethora of material, especially in the 21st century. The legation has had a role in all three types of cultural heritage preservation, as is appropriate given the porous barriers between one type and another. In Archive Wars, The Politics of History in Saudi Arabia, Rosie Bashir writes, quote, "We think of archiving, memorializing, and urban planning as distinct and separate. The domains of history making and urban planning are, in fact, mutually constitutive. To make history is to remake space, and like all archival formations, both are ongoing and contested material practices of state formation." Bashir's excellent book is focused on the political processes surrounding the formation and legitimization of the nation state, a focus that is very different from mine in this presentation, but her point is well taken. The Tangier American Legation Museum is simultaneously the product of and a site for cultural heritage preservation. In the late 19th century, most foreign powers that had relations with Morocco had a property in the old Medina of Tangier. And you can see that in this diagram here, where this is from a 1901 traveler's guide, the Baedekers. And you can see that all of the legations, if not actually within the walls of the Medina, were very close to the outside. By the early 20th century, only the legation remained intramuros. Indeed, in one form or another, the legation served as an official diplomatic representation of the United States for 140 years, longer than any other US facility. The property itself is a designated cultural monument, clearly important to the United States, but also important to Morocco. The museum and its library, established in 1976 as a repository for artwork, or is a repository for artwork, maps, documents, photographs, artifacts, and other material relating to the shared history of the US and Morocco, but also a fair number of other nations and civilizations as well. In an article published in the December 1989 Bulletin of the Middle East Studies Association, then Talms librarian Priscilla Roberts summarized the content of the legation's collection. The museum's collections range from 18th and 19th century European engravings on Morocco, prints and antique maps from the 16th to the 20th century, to a very comprehensive collection of art on Gibraltar, to furnishings and rugs. Two major art collections are gifts from longtime Tangier residents Donald Angus and Miss Marguerite McBay, widow of James McBay, the Scottish painter. The growing library has over 2,500 volumes of books, monographs, theses, documents, and serials dating from the 17th century to the present. Special emphasis is on the study of Morocco, although Talim has holdings on all of North Africa. It owns an extensive collection of English language newspapers published in Tangier dating from 1883 and microfilm copies of a unique newspaper published in London and devoted to Morocco, 1918 to 1924. Microfilms from the U.S. National Archives of State Department records between Morocco and the United States, dispatches from U.S. consuls generals in Tangier from 1797 to 1906 are also included in the collection. She goes on to mention several manuscript collections, old photographs, 2,000 glass plate negatives, and maps donated to Talim. The map holdings range from 16th and 17th century antique ones of Barbary to cadastral, topographic, and road maps of the Spanish and French protectorates to military maps of cities during World War II. The collection has grown considerably since that was published in 1989, with substantial donations from the collections of anthropologist David M. Hart, Ambassador Joseph Werner Reed, whose long diplomatic career included a stint as U.S. Ambassador to Morocco from 1981 to 1985, and the entrepreneur and publisher Malcolm S. Forbes, as well as numerous other donors. While I cannot do justice to the role of the legation in preserving, perpetuating, and transforming intangible cultural heritage, given that I have chosen to frame this presentation within UNESCO's definitions of cultural heritage, it must be discussed. The legation's Associate Director, Ihtimad Bouziane, has taken the lead on this, working with the residence directors, Tor Cunningham, Gerald Loftus, and perhaps most productively, John Davidson, the current director, to ensure this is the case. The legation plays host to the Fondation Tanger Medina, FATAM, to run literacy programs, cooking classes, and crafts programs for the women and children of Tangier, as well as various arts programs for children. The legation also collaborates with numerous local institutions to enrich the cultural scene of the city. The museum plays host to and organizes a lively cultural program. One of the most striking illustrations of the legation's role in preserving intangible cultural heritage may be the She Stage series that brings local artists to perform at the legation. Organized by the legation's former outreach coordinator, Ayoub El-Jamal, these performances happened live with an audience in the legation up until the COVID pandemic, but they continued live without an audience during the pandemic, broadcast on Facebook and recorded on YouTube. And here you see a live performance in the museum and then a YouTube recording of a performance. The outreach coordinator is a unique position in the Talim staff in that it is funded by the U.S. Embassy in Morocco. Talim's preservation of cultural heritage has been a highly collaborative endeavor. I'm extraordinarily proud of the interinstitutional effort to preserve the previously mentioned collection of approximately 2,000 medium format, that's 4 by 5 inches, glass negatives, simultaneously making them more accessible to researchers and the general public. The majority of the images in the collection document Tangier between the First and Second World Wars, though there are also photographs taken in various locations throughout Morocco, Algeria, southern Spain, and France. And there are also images that would appear to be taken as early as the late 19th century. Given that they came to the legation with no descriptions of any kind, it has been and still is an enormous ongoing effort to fully identify the contents of the images. They are believed to be the work of Paul Servant, a longtime resident of Tangier. Though some of his photographs did appear in print, most notably publications from the local tourism office at which he worked, he is not believed to have been a professional photographer. The negatives were donated to Talim by art collector, philanthropist, and sometimes resident of Tangier, Donald Angus, 1908 to 2001. The images of the collection provide important and rare visual documentation of life in the Western Mediterranean at a period when nearly every aspect of society was in flux. In addition to portraits and photographs documenting the daily life of the city's inhabitants, images capture the construction of the port, the railway, and some of the city's best known buildings. Currently, all the photographs are available on arcnet.org through a collaboration between Wellesley College, the Aga Khan Documentation Center at MIT, and Talim. In the summer of 2014, AKDC launched an ongoing collaborative with Wellesley College's Office of Career Education and Program for Middle Eastern Studies to continue the digitization of the negatives. Over the course of 3 summers, interns from the college completed the digitization of the negatives and began cataloging them for ArcNet. The first images from the collection were made available on ArcNet in November 2014. Images were reviewed by the ArcNet content manager, myself, and made available in installments. By the end of summer 2016, all images were available on ArcNet. I am currently in the process of conducting a detailed review of the metadata on all images, synthesizing the readily available information listed above, and conducting further research. I hope this collaboration, this 3-way collaboration between Wellesley College, Talim, and the Aga Khan Documentation Center can resume once pandemic conditions are resolved. AKDC has also worked with Talim, the American Folklife Center of the Library of Congress, and the estate of Paul Bowles to make available over 70 hours of audio recordings made throughout Morocco between 1959 and 1962. These recordings include a vast array of musical styles, including religious chanting, Muslim and Jewish, including the call to prayer, etc. Shabi, Andalusian, and Ganawa music, and a wide variety of music from tribal communities of the Rif, Atlas, and Sus. These recordings had been digitized by the legation, but the files were not publicly available, and hence the agreement to make them available on ArcNet. From these few examples, it is clear that the Tangier American Legation is an important and successful cultural heritage institution, but it is also one that faces some significant challenges. Some of the challenges are the same that most other cultural heritage institutions face, but others are specific to the legation. And this is the presentation page for the glass negatives collection. Now, in terms of challenges, The first is the need for highly trained conservation and collection staff, including conservationists, archivists, librarians, and specialist curators. That is not to say that these people need to be employed by Talim on a full-time continual basis. But in a country like Morocco, the demand for such specialists exceeds the availability, though the picture is improving. The second challenge is need for proper preservation facilities and supplies. And by this, I mean such things as acid-free mountings for maps and images and photographs, archival boxes with fasteners on the outside rather than the inside, UV-resistant glass, folders that do not damage images and that keep out light and keep out moisture, etc. And that actually brings me to the next set of challenges, which are location and environmental challenges. Tangier is located on the Strait of Gibraltar, and therefore it's very humid and very damp. The legation is, for the most part, a traditional building built in traditional style with stone and cement, and therefore tends to hold moisture, tends to be difficult to climate control, and therefore causes a great deal of challenges for preservation. There are also perfect conditions for mold, insects, and rodents, since the Tangier is relatively warm year-round. And then there's also the issue of poor infrastructure, which can at any time lead to flooding or other issues that may come from the streets or from outside. The next challenge is balancing the preservation of a historic edifice with the protection of a valuable collection. This is one of those issues that all cultural heritage institutions face. And it's a matter of constantly shifting the balance between what is on display and what isn't, what factors to prioritize in storage facilities, digitization, etc. And when it is worth the loss of historic authenticity to climate proof, protect against sunlight, etc., etc. Then there's the issue of digital preservation. And by that, I mean not just digitized items. Digitizing items is not actually a preservation strategy. It is a dissemination strategy and a protection strategy, or it is actually a preservation strategy insofar as it means that people no longer have to access the actual objects without causing potential damage. Even the oil on our hands can cause damage to paper, especially something like newspaper. But I'm also talking about, and even more talking about here, is increasingly items that are being born digital. And this includes things being produced by the legation itself. Photographs of events, recordings of events, correspondence between staff and donors, et cetera, et cetera. So digital preservation is a challenge completely of a new order, because you're preserving something that essentially exists only in a non-tangible form. And then there's the challenge of documenting our own history as an organization. And by this, I mean in more in terms of the organization within the United States, and collecting and preserving material on our history, our events, etc. We are a distributed organization, an all-volunteer organization, and therefore this does in fact become a challenge. And then, of course, there's the ultimate issue, that of funding. Now, I don't want to overemphasize this because Talim is on very stable ground financially. It does not have a significant endowment that can guarantee operations decades into the future, but it's also not in financial difficulty, far from it, in fact. But this is the same dilemma faced by all cultural heritage institutions other than those that are state supported or enormously wealthy in their own rights. The Metropolitan Museum would be an example. British Museum would be another. It's also a bit of a challenge because our overseas location takes the legation out of the running for certain preservation grants and certain grants that are only available to US-based institutions. The legation has come a long way in tackling some of these issues already. For example, rare books are now kept in a more secure location, and ongoing restorations are tackling some of the most intractable environmental issues, such as leaking roofs, moisture seeping into various parts of the building. There's been a lot of work done on this by the embassy in recent years. During the reign of Mohammed VI, Morocco has prioritized cultural heritage preservation to an unprecedented degree, including the revival of the National Archives and the construction of a new national library. As the legation continues to build relationships with partner institutions, collaboration may offer additional solutions to some of the challenges that I've just mentioned. For example, cultural heritage properties that face issues with collection storage often build, lease, or borrow more suitable storage facilities. By borrow, I mean reaching agreements with other institutions whereby they maintain ownership of the collection, but access and use becomes a responsibility of the host institution. There is no doubt that Talim's future as an important cultural heritage institution is well and secure into the foreseeable future and beyond. Thanks to our many supporters and friends. But in this presentation, I hope I have taken a moment just to raise awareness of some of the issues and challenges and ways that we have surmounted them in the past. And thank you for your time.